This podcast is a work of historical interpretation. While we strive for accuracy, some aspects of history are open to interpretation and debate. Thank you for listening.
June 2025, Los Angeles. The sky is hazy, not from wildfires this time, but from the heat shimmering off asphalt and the exhaust of idling vehicles. Outside the Federal Detention Center on Alameda Street, there's a wall of uniforms. California National Guard troops, federally controlled now, stand shoulder to shoulder in front of a row of Marines. Their faces are unreadable behind dark glasses.
Down the block, a line of ICE SUVs idles, each one with its engines rumbling and its air conditioning on full blast. Guard soldiers have set up at intersections, checking IDs and redirecting foot traffic. Protesters chant to wave signs, but every so often you see someone pulled from the crowd and led away in zip ties. The official line is that the troops aren't doing law enforcement. But if you're here watching it happen, it's hard to see the difference.
You'd be forgiven for thinking this is a grainy clip from a riot decades ago or some civil rights confrontation out of the 1960s. But this isn't the past. This is a few weeks ago, and the president ordered active duty Marines and federalized National Guard into a major U.S. city without the governor's consent.
And if that sounds shocking, hang on. Because today, as we're sitting here recording, it's happening again.
This time, it's not Los Angeles. It's Washington, D.C. President Donald Trump has just declared a public safety emergency, taking care of the Metropolitan Police Department for the next 30 days, and ordered 800 National Guard troops into the city.
Mayor Muriel Bowser says it's unprecedented and unlawful. House Republicans say it's justified. Civil rights groups are furious, and if you think this is a one-off, think again. Unprecedented, yes. Unlawful?
She still said that it was.
I know.
I'm just saying that's a quote from,
Unprecedented, yes, I agree with.
Yeah.
It's not normal.
Yeah. Which brings us to our question for today. When can a U.S. president use the military on American soil? And what happens if the boundaries we thought were clear aren't so clear anymore?
To answer that, we need to talk about the Posse Comitatus Act. It's one of those laws you may have heard about in passing, maybe in a civics class, maybe in a movie, but it's at the heart of this whole story.
The act is supposed to keep the U.S. military out of domestic law enforcement, and yet, time after time, presidents have pushed at its edges, invoked exceptions, or just ignored the spirit of it.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take you back to where it started, in the messy, bitter aftermath of the Civil War. Then we'll walk through some of the biggest moments in the last century and a half when presidents crossed that line or stood right on it. And finally, we'll bring it back to today, to what Trump did in Los Angeles and what he's doing right now in D.C. and why it matters more than ever.
Let's start in 1878. The Civil War has been over for 13 years, but federal troops are still stationed in parts of the South. Their job is to enforce Reconstruction laws, protect newly freed Black citizens, and make sure elections aren't stolen by intimidation and violence.
If you're a white Southern politician in that era, you hate this. Reconstruction is an obstacle to regaining total local control. And after the contested election of 1876, the Southern Democrats cut a deal with the Republicans. The presidency would go to Rutherford B. Hayes, and in exchange, the last federal troops would be withdrawn from the South.
The very next year, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act. The language is simple but powerful. You can't use the Army, and later the Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Space Force, to enforce domestic laws unless Congress or the Constitution specifically says so.
It's worth noting, this wasn't born out of some high-minded desire to protect civil liberties. It was about power, plain and simple. The South wanted the feds gone so they could suppress Black voters without interference. But once the law was in place, the idea that we don't turn the military into a national police force stuck around.
Of course, that doesn't mean it was never tested, and our first big test came just 16 years later in summer of 1894.
This was the Pullman strike. the Pullman company made railroad cars. And when they cut wages without lowering rent in their company town, the workers walked out. The American Railway Union backed them, and soon rail traffic was paralyzed across much of the country.
You still need to do that episode. In Chicago, where the strike was strongest, the governor of Illinois, John Altgeld, said he had the situation under control and didn't want federal troops. But President Grover Cleveland didn't agree.
Cleveland sent in the army to back the strike, arguing that the mail was being disrupted and interstate commerce was under a threat. Violence followed. Soldiers clashed with strikers, and several people were killed.
Legally, Cleveland could point to federal authority over the mail and commerce, but politically, it was a reminder that if a president really wanted to put troops on the street, the Posse Comitatus Act alone might not stop him.
That theme repeats over and over. The law is a boundary, but boundaries can be crossed if you claim the right authority.
Fast forward to 1932, the Great Depression, which wasn't very great. In Washington, D.C., thousands of World War I veterans, known as the
Bonus Army,
camp out to demand early payment of the bonuses they've been promised. Congress says no. Tensions rise, and President Herbert Hoover orders the Army to clear the camps.
This wasn't a riot. These were veterans, many with families living in makeshift shelters. But when the Army moved in, led by General Douglas MacArthur with tanks and cavalry, they used tear gas and burned the camps. People were injured, 2 veterans were killed, and the public was horrified.
Technically, the PCA didn't apply in D.C. the same way it does in the states, since the district was under direct federal control, but the optics were terrible. It reinforced the idea that using the military against civilians is a last resort, and even then, dangerous.
And then there's 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas. This is one of the rare times when breaking that line was about enforcing civil rights. Governor Orville Faubus refused to integrate Central High School, defying a federal court order.
President Dwight D. Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent in the 101st Airborne Division to escort the Little Rock Nine into school. He invoked the Insurrection Act, which is one of the legal exceptions to Posse Comitatus.
Here, the military was protecting citizens from their own state government. It's a reminder that sometimes the president using troops domestically can be the right call, but it depends entirely on the circumstances.
In 1967, Detroit erupted in one of the worst urban riots in American history. Looting, arson, gunfire, the governor called in the National Guard. But when that wasn't enough, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent in Army paratroopers at the governor's request. Again, this was under the Insurrection Act with state consent.
Key point, state consent.
Yes, the state asked for help.
Yes. And in 1992, after the acquittal of the officers who beat Rodney King, Los Angeles burned. The California National Guard was activated, and President George H.W. Bush sent in Marines and federal agents, again at the governor's request.
Notice the pattern. The biggest deployments since the Civil War either happened with state consent or under the Insurrection Act when states were defying federal law.
Which is what makes June 2025 so different, because in Los Angeles, Trump didn't have state consent. In fact, he had the complete opposite. And he didn't invoke the Insurrection Act.
He used a different law, one meant for actual rebellion or invasion, to take control of the California National Guard and send in active-duty Marines. Officially, they were just there to protect federal property and personnel.
But evidence in the ongoing lawsuit shows that they were doing a lot more than that. Troops accompanied ICE agents on raids, set up parameters around civilian arrest, and even detained people themselves before turning them over to police.
Governor Gavin Newsom called it an occupation. The ACLU said it was a declaration of war on Californians. And now, in court, the question is whether this was a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act and maybe the Constitution.
Just as that's playing out, we get today's news. The president taking over the D.C. police and sending in the guard there. No state governor to object this time because D.C. doesn't have one.
What makes this not just a legal battle, but a test of norms if this becomes routine, is if presidents can put troops on the streets whenever they see fit, then the line the Posse Comitatus Act was meant to draw starts to disappear. So let's break down exactly what happened in Los Angeles, step by step, because the timeline matters here.
It starts in late May 2025. The administration announces a huge expansion of immigration enforcement in California. Coordinated raids by ICE across Los Angeles County. The targets aren't just workplaces. They're neighborhoods, apartment buildings, even churches. It's aggressive, and it's clearly meant to send a message.
California's leadership, Governor Newsom, who is amazing on X.
It almost makes me want to have X again, but
Hey, you can still
I
see
deleted it.
pop up.
Right. I deleted it after the elections.
Yeah. Attorney General Rob Bonta, the LA mayor, immediately denounced it. They promised not to use local police resources to help ICE, and they set up legal aid centers to help those targeted.
The raids still happen. Protests erupt. At first, it's the usual. Marches, vigils, some traffic blockades. But then, in early June, a few incidents turn violent. A protest near an ICE facility in San Pedro ends with federal troops pepper spraying the crowd. In Boyle Heights, a Homeland Security SUV gets its windows smashed.
On June 8th, Trump takes a step that shocks everybody. He issues an order federalizing the California National Guard under 10 U.S.C. 12406, a law that's supposed to be for times of rebellion or invasion, and at the same time deploys about 700 active-duty Marines from Camp Pendleton into L.A.
Governor Newsom finds out basically the same time the public does. His office gets a terse notification from the Pentagon that the Guard is under federal command effective immediately. Newsom goes in front of cameras and calls it, quote, illegal, immoral, and a dangerous abuse of power, unquote.
And the public reaction? Polarized. Trump supporters say he's finally getting tough on sanctuary cities. His critics say this is exactly the kind of thing that the Posse Comitatus Act was meant to prevent.
Here's the kicker. Officially, the mission is to protect federal property and personnel.
Good quotes there.
Finger quotes you couldn't see, sorry.
I could.
The White House insists troops aren't doing law enforcement. But within a week, photos and videos are circulating.
Fake news.
Guard soldiers blocking intersections during ICE operations. Marines standing shoulder to shoulder with Homeland Security agents at building entrances.
By mid-June, California files a federal lawsuit, State of California versus Trump. They argue that employment violates the PCA, the Constitution, and the statutory requirement that orders be issued through the governor. They want the Guard returned to state control and an injunction stopping the military from assisting in law enforcement.
The case lands in Judge Charles Breyer's courtroom in San Francisco. He issues a preliminary order siding with California, saying the situation doesn't look like a rebellion or insurrection. But the Ninth Circuit stays that order pending appeal, so the deployment continues.
And then we get into the discovery phase. This is where the state gets to present evidence of what the troops actually did. They produce after-action reports, deposition testimony, and even body cam footage showing the military personnel weren't just, quote, protecting federal property. They were actively participating in arrests or creating perimeters so ICE could arrest people without interference.
One deposition from a Guard officer flat out admits that in about 70 to 75% of the ICE raids in LA during June, Guard troops were present and integrated into the operation. In 2 documented cases, military personnel physically detained civilians before handing them over to police.
That's the kind of thing the PCA is supposed to prohibit unless Congress or the Constitution says otherwise. And here, Trump hadn't invoked the Insurrection Act, which is the clearest legal way to override the PCA.
So that's Los Angeles, an unprecedented use of federalized guards and active-duty military against the explicit wishes of a state government, with strong evidence they crossed into law enforcement. And that's still in court right now.
which makes today's D.C. move feel less like an isolated decision and more like part of a pattern.
Right. Let's walk through what happened today, August 11, 2025. The president issues an executive order declaring a quote-unquote crime emergency in Washington, D.C., and invokes Section 740 of the D.C. Home Rule Act. That gives him the power to take direct control of the Metropolitan Police Department for up to 30 days.
He also orders 800 National Guard troops into the city because D.C. has no governor. The Guard there is already under presidential control, so there's no legal wrangling over federalizing them. They're his to command when it suits him.
Right. They were also his to command on January 6, 2021.
But he lost their phone number at that point in time.
Yeah. Mayor Bowser and D.C.'s Attorney General are furious. They say crime in the city is actually down from last year and that this is just another political stunt. Civil rights groups say it's a power grab.
House Republicans, meanwhile, are backing it. They've been holding hearings on D.C. crime and using it as talking points for months. This move fits right into their narrative, that the president has to step in where local leadership fails.
It's also worth noting the optics, two major high political examples in the span of weeks where the president put troops in the streets of a Democrat-led city. And in both cases, the justification is thin, at least compared to the historic norms we've seen with posse comitatus.
And this brings us full circle to the big question. If the law says the military can't be used for domestic policing, but the president keeps finding ways to do it anyway, does the law still mean anything? Let's pull back from the headlines for a minute and talk about what the Posse Comitatus Act actually says, and more importantly, what it doesn't say.
Right, because it's not a sweeping ban on ever using the military inside the U.S. It's actually pretty narrow. The original 1878 law only covers the Army, because that's all we had. Well, we had Navy.
Yeah.
Duh. Over time, Congress amended it to include the Air Force. Then, by policy and later law, the Navy, Marines, and Space Force. The Coast Guard's exempt entirely because they got law enforcement powers in peacetime, which is interesting because I was just watching documentaries on Hurricane Katrina, and that is why the Coast Guard was one of the first people actually with boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have to wait for anybody saying they were allowed to.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's also why they do a lot of the border type stuff.
Yeah.
And rescues and all that kind of.
Yep.
The heart of it is this. It's a federal crime to willfully use the armed forces to execute the laws unless the Constitution or Congress says you can't. And execute the laws means the kind of things police do. Arrests, searches, evidence gathering, and crowd control.
There are exceptions. The big one is the Insurrection Act, which lets the president send in the military to suppress rebellions, enforce federal law, or protect civil rights. That's how Eisenhower could send in the 101st Airborne to Little Rock in 1957, and how George H.W. Bush could send the Marines into L.A. in 1992. Both times, the law was invoked.
There's also Title 32 status for the National Guard. That's when Guard troops are under state command, but funded by the feds. That's how Trump in 2020 had out-of-state Guard in D.C. without triggering posse comitatus. Technically, they weren't under federal control.
Stinky. And then there are special carve-outs. Military support for drug interdiction, disaster relief, protecting federal property. All okay, as long as the troops aren't directly enforcing the law.
That last one's key. Presidents have leaned hard on protecting federal property as a catch-all. That's the loophole. In Los Angeles, the claim that troops were only guarding buildings and personnel.
But if those troops are shoulder to shoulder with ICE agents during a raid, blocking intersections, setting parameters, even physically detaining people, that starts to look like law enforcement, not just protection or prevention of violence.
Yeah. Historically, when presidents have crossed that line without state consent, it's been rare and in high-stakes scenarios, like Eisenhower at Arkansas, Kennedy at the University of Mississippi in '62, Johnson sending troops to Selma in 65, and those were all framed as defending constitutional rights against defiant state governments.
Or Washington with the Whiskey Rebellion. Major throwback.
Wait for that episode.
Trump's LA and DC actions don't look like that. They look more like Cleveland in the Pullman strike, overriding a governor who didn't want troops. Or Hoover with the bonus army, using force to impose federal will on civilians in peacetime. And in both those cases, the backlash was huge.
The legal challenge in California boils down to 2 points. One, the president can't invoke 10 U.S.C. 12406 to federalize the state's guard without going through the governor, and he clearly didn't here. Two, even if he could, having those troops perform law enforcement without an Insurrection Act invocation violates the Posse Comitatus Act.
The government's argument is the flip side. They say that status lets the president act unilaterally in a rebellion or when federal law can't be executed by regular means. And they insist perimeter security and escorting agents isn't executing the laws, it's support that they didn't ask for.
The trouble is, if the courts buy that definition, it opens a massive loophole. Any president could put troops anywhere and say, they're just supporting, even if the effect is exactly like having the military do policing.
Which brings us back to D.C. today. No governor, because D.C. isn't a state.
They should be, but that's a whole other.
That might have to happen later, but D.C. is a district. It is not a state. So there is no governor. And that means no consent problem. The guard's already federal. And under the Home Rule Act, the president does have the power to take control of MPD during emergencies.
Once again, whenever he sees it fit.
When he thinks there's an emergency.
Yes. The fight here isn't about whether he can, it's about whether he should, and what kind of precedent it sets when an emergency starts to mean whenever I say so.
And that's the danger in both cases. The letter of the law might mean one thing, but the spirit of the law, keeping military and civilian policing separate, erodes each line that gets blurred.
Let's line up some of the key moments where presidents used military domestically and see how they compare to what happened in LA and what's happening in DC.
First, 1894, the Pullman strike. We've already touched on it, but here's the context. The strike crippled rail traffic nationwide, which was the primary source of traffic
I
back
wish it
then.
still was.
Illinois governor said that he had things under control and didn't want federal troops. Cleveland sent them anyway, saying the mail had to be moved and interstate commerce had to flow, which the federal government does have control, or not control, but say so in interstate commerce. That is something.
It was legally shaky, politically explosive, and it ended in violence. Over 24 people killed, courts upheld his action, but it cemented the idea that presidential use of troops over a state's objections would be controversial no matter the legal cover.
Fast forward to 1932, the bonus army. Thousands of World War I veterans set up camp in D.C. to demand early payment of bonuses. Congress said no. Hoover sent in the army. Again, this is the District of Columbia and not a state, and therefore, again, does not need governor consent or request. Tanks and cavalry pushed unarmed veterans and their families out, burned their camps, and tear gassed the streets.
Here's where it's similar to today. In both 1932 and in D.C. now, the president doesn't have to deal with a governor.
We keep saying that. Sorry, I jumped a line.
D.C. is under federal authority, but the real similarity is optics, military force against civilians in a political dispute. Hoover never recovered politically.
Yeah, the Great Depression itself might have done more damage than...
It was great.
It was, yeah.
Such a great depression. It was the greatest depression ever so far. There will be an even greater and more bigly one.
Then there's 1957, Little Rock. This is one of the few examples where using troops against a state's wishes is generally viewed positively. Eisenhower was enforcing a Supreme Court ruling to integrate public schools. He had clear legal authority under the Insurrection Act and a moral case grounded in civil rights.
Trump's LA deployment doesn't have the moral or legal clarity. He wasn't enforcing a court order or protecting constitutional rights. He was enforcing his own immigration policy against the state that objected.
In 1967, Detroit saw one of the worst urban riots in U.S. history. Governor George Romney called in the National Guard, which is his right. When that wasn't enough, he asked President Johnson for help. Johnson sent in Army paratroopers. State consent, clear public safety emergency, the opposite of L.A. in 2025.
Same with the 1992 L.A. riots after the Rodney King verdict. Governor Pete Wilson requested federal help. George H.W. Bush sent Marines and active duty troops, legal authority, state consent, and a crisis that was beyond local control.
And then 2020, the George Floyd protest. Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act, but didn't. Instead, he used federal agents and National Guard in D.C. without needing state consent, since D.C.'s Guard answers to him. At least they did in 2020. Apparently in 2021, they didn't. I don't know what happened there.
He lost their phone number.
Yeah. Anyways, that Lafayette Square incident, clearing protesters for a photo op, those holding a Bible in front of a church, was a warning sign of what we're seeing now.
The pattern's clear. Most past uses of troops at home happen with the cooperation of state governments or under the Insurrection Act in extraordinary situations. The exceptions, Pullman, Bonus Army, Lafayette Square, are remembered as low points.
And if you add LA 2025 and DC today to that list, you see a different kind of pattern emerging. One where a president uses military or police control as a political weapon against jurisdictions he doesn't like.
Which is exactly why the Posse Comitatus Act exists, but a law is only as strong as the willingness to enforce it. And right now, the courts are the only thing standing between these deployments and the new normal. So let's talk about where this could go from here, because we're not just talking about one lawsuit in California and one power grab in D.C. This is about precedent.
Exactly. If the courts side with Trump in the California case, they'll be saying, yes, the president can federalize a state's National Guard without the governor's consent, and yes, he can integrate them into federal law enforcement operations as long as he calls it support. That's a green light for future presidents to do the same. In any state, for any reason, they can frame as enforcing federal law.
And if they side with California, it'll be a rare rebuke of presidential power in this area. But even then, the D.C. example shows there's still plenty of room for a president to act in the Capitol without any state-level pushback.
The risk isn't just about legal authority. It's about normalizing the sight of military uniforms in civilian streets. Once people get used to that, it stops feeling like an emergency measure and starts feeling like just another tool in the toolbox.
And history tells us that's a dangerous shift. The Posse Comitatus Act was passed because the public had seen enough of soldiers enforcing political will during the Reconstruction. The U.S. has always had an instinctive distrust of the standing army being used at home.
That's why even in genuine crisis like Detroit 67 and LA 92, presidents went out of their way to get state consent. They knew that without it, they'd be accused of overreach.
But in a hyperpolarized environment, a president might actually want the accusation. The backlash can become part of the political strategy, painting governors or mayors as weak or lawless and using the deployment as proof that Washington had to step in.
Which is exactly how Trump's framing it in LA. He says Newsom failed to enforce federal law. In D.C., he says Bowser failed to keep the city safe. In both cases, he gets to play the role of the one taking action while his opponents are cast as obstacles.
And for his supporters, the legality isn't the point. The optics are. They see troops on the streets as decisive action.
But the law matters because once you stretch an exception far enough, it becomes the new rule. And that's how norms erode. Not all at once, but in little steps that feel less shocking each time. It's desensitization.
Let's game this out. Imagine a future president. Are you imagining?
Sure.
Okay, good. Doesn't matter the party. using this precedent to send troops into a state that passes a law they don't like or to, quote, secure polling stations during an election in the name of preventing fraud.
That's not far-fetched. In fact, California's lawyers in the current case have warned about exactly that. Any president, using federal troops to influence or intimidate voters under the guise of executing the laws.
And remember, the PCA doesn't apply to certain agencies like the Coast Guard or to DC's police when the president takes them over. So there are already holes in the wall.
The courts can patch one hole in California, but they can't rebuild the wall entirely. That's going to require Congress. And let's be honest, Congress isn't exactly lining up to limit presidential power these days.
So where does that leave us? Right now, we're in the middle of a live test. One branch of government, the executive, is pushing the limits. Another branch, the judiciary, has to decide whether to draw the line. And the legislative branch, at best, is watching from the sidelines.
And the rest of us, we get to decide whether we care. Whether the idea that the military shouldn't be used for domestic policing is still worth defending, even when it's politically convenient to look the other way.
So it's worth remembering that every time in history when presidents used troops domestically without a clear dire necessity, the public eventually saw it as a mistake. Pullman, Bonus Army, Lafayette Square.
Or doesn't use it, in the case of Katrina, or delays. The question is whether we'll have the perspective to see that before the damage is done this time.
Because once the sight of Humvees at a protest or Marines at a city intersection becomes routine, it's a lot harder to go back.
And that's why understanding the history matters, so we can see these aren't isolated events. They're part of a long-running struggle over where military power ends and civilian life begins.
In the end, the Posse Comitatus Act is just words on paper. It's the people in courts, in Congress, in the streets who decide whether these words mean something.
And that decision's being made right now, in real time, in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
We'll be watching, and so should you.
When you lay the whole thing out, from Reconstruction to today, you start to see the Posse Comitatus Act not just as legal speed bump, but as a barometer. When the temperature of politics rises, the temperature to push troops into domestic roles rise too.
And the irony is, the act's origins weren't noble. It was born out of a political deal that ended federal protection for black citizens in the South. But over the decades, it became one of those guardrails that you don't appreciate until someone leans too hard on it.
It's a lot like the idea of civilian control of the military, something Americans take for granted until there's a real test. And right now, we're in one of those tests.
And here's where I think this gets tricky. If the California case drags on, and it probably will, we might not get a final Supreme Court decision until well into the next election cycle. By then, the LA deployment could be old news, and today's DC move could be replaced by something even more dramatic.
Because Americans have nothing if not short-term memory problems, or long-term memory problems with short-term memories.
Yes.
Anyway. Which means the precedent could be set by habit, not by ruling. If no one stops it, it starts to feel normal, and the courts may be less willing to step in after the fact.
And if a future president decides to go further, say ordering the military to help secure the southern border inside a state that doesn't want them there, or to break up a massive protest movement, the legal and political groundwork will already be in place.
There's a phrase I keep coming back to from constitutional law classes. Quote, the exception swallows the rule, unquote. That's the danger here. The exceptions to Posse Comitatus, Insurrection Act, protection of federal property, National Guard status quirks were supposed to be rare, but they're getting used in ways that cover more and more situations.
And remember, the Insurrection Act itself is incredibly broad. It doesn't even require an actual insurrection. Domestic violence that hinders the execution of laws could be interpreted to fit a lot of scenarios.
And presidents know that, which is why, or at least their advisors know that, which is why, for most of history, they've been careful about how they use it. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want the political blowback.
Trump's calculation seems different. The blowback is the point. The more critics call it authoritarian, the more his supporters see it as strong leadership.
Mm-hmm. And that's where public opinion comes in. If enough people across political lines decide they're okay with troops in the streets, as long as they agree with the reason, then the restraint that's defined most of American history in this area starts to vanish.
That's the part I find unsettling, because once you open that door, you can't control who walks through it next.
If the California case goes against Trump, it could reassert some of that restraint, at least for guard deployments without state consent. But it won't touch what he did in D.C. today.
And that's the loophole nobody talks about enough. Federal territories, D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, all places where the president can act directly without state governments getting in the way.
It's worth remembering that D.C.'s residents don't get a vote in Congress, but they can have troops on their streets and their police force taken over by the president they didn't elect. That's a democracy problem layered on top of a civil military problem.
So where do we go from here? If history's a guide, we'll probably get a few more high-profile flashpoints, the courts will narrow some authority, but leave most of it intact, and presidents will keep finding new ways to operate in the gray zones.
The best-case scenario is that Congress decides to clarify the law, tighten definitions, set clear triggers, maybe require some form of judicial or legislative review for certain deployments. But given the political climate right now, that's optimistic.
Which leaves public awareness. People knowing what the Posse Comitatus Act is, why it exists, and how it's being tested. That's the point of doing an episode like this.
Because if we don't understand the history, we can't see when it's being rewritten in real time, which reminds me that administration is also going to be inspecting the Smithsonian's.
And right now, that rewriting is happening in a courtroom in San Francisco over LA and on the streets of DC today.
Okay.
And some oversight of the Smithsonian that all of a sudden appeared.
Yeah. That's not,
because history you can change to suit your narrative.
That's not normal.
No, that's definitely not.
Presidential administrations have not, in general, cared what the Smithsonian showed or didn't show, with some exceptions, of course, like when stuff's still sealed.
Yeah.
Or like they might gently. Of course, this brings up a West Wing episode where they were setting up for Pearl Harbor World War II exhibition, and some of the veterans were mad at some of the propaganda that was being shown, like from that era. So Toby had to smooth over some things, but in general, they don't care. That's
it's history.
It's tiny little details that who cares?
Yeah.
Like there's somebody in charge of the Smithsonian for a reason. And it's not the president of the United States. But anyways, we'll keep following both. And the next time you see soldiers at the intersections in America, ask yourself, is this the exception or is this the new rule?
And if it's the new rule, are we okay with that?
That's for all of us to answer.
For the Time Tellers, I'm Dan.
And I'm Renee.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.